Let's go on to the next one. So this shows you what the legislative analyst anticipates as far as our deficits in future years. And as you can see, they're huge, they get larger and larger, and they continue on into the future. So that means that we have got to figure out some long-term answers to this problem, or we're simply going to continue experiencing years like we have this year. Let's go on to the next one. I don't think that sound was supposed to accompany this slide, but we'll see what happens with the next one. This is the year where we had the economic meltdown, and I will never forget this experience. I was not the chair of the Budget Committee at this time last year. This time last year, we had a complete meltdown. You remember Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, and then there was the bailout, and then there was the election, and everybody's, really excited, and, change we can believe in, and we're hoping that wonderful things are going to happen. That's when I took over as the chair of the Budget Committee. And that's when we started to see that the bottom was dropping out of the California economy as well. And we ended up losing, between that date and the end of April, we ended up losing almost a quarter of our anticipated general fund revenues, which meant that the budget that we had adopted for this fiscal year back in March, simply, you could just rip it up. It didn't apply. Let's go on to the next one. So this slide, and there's a lot of words in it, and forgive me, but there's a lot of information for you to digest. And this is the one that everybody wants to take a copy of, and if you need a copy, let me know. But this, we ended up having to close a $24 billion deficit in July, on top of a $41 billion deficit the year before. So we had to make some serious decisions. And I'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of the decision making in the Capitol. Actually I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But we, even though the Democrats are in control, we can't just wave a magic wand and say, well, we're going to raise revenues. We have to figure out, first of all, that's not necessarily the most responsible thing to do. Second of all, we need 2/3 of the legislators to go along with it. And third of all, we have to have the governor's agreement. So we had to have a lot of negotiations, but we ended up making significant budget cuts, and those are the ones that you're struggling with right now. We also had raised $12.5 billion in new taxes. One of the more problematic things to me is that we ended up borrowing. We borrowed from local governments, cities and counties, and we borrowed money from schools, and we borrowed money from future revenue years. So what we basically did was we mortgaged the next 2 to 3 years of our budgets to balance this one. And I just want to tell you, the reason I can't defend this is, first of all, I don't think it's the, what, as I said, as Queen of the state, I would have done. But someday maybe there will be a position, Queen of the state, but not right now. To me, what we did was we ended up, you might remember the governor back in May had proposed shutting down programs, completely shutting down CalWORKs, Cal Grants, Healthy Families, in-home supportive services, closing down our state parks. And these are programs that not only Californians want and need if we're going to provide opportunities for them in the future, but also they're economic engines for our state. So for every dollar we cut out of these programs, and you see we cut $30.5 billion in program expenditures, we turned away between $1 and $4 of federal funds. In some programs, and there's one healthcare program in particular, we turned away $10 in federal dollars for every $1 we cut. So we're in a time of recession where we really have to get Californians back to work, and we need to bring our economy back. What we did was the opposite. So what saved us in part is the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act funds. And that was very nice, but it's also very short term, and it was really only about 1/3 of what we needed. Let's go on to the next slide. One last thing I wanted to add, and the reason why ultimately I had to get myself to the point where I could cast an aye vote in favor of this budget was the state was literally on the fiscal cliff. Normally, and the controller has told me this, normally we will have different special funds with balances that we can borrow against. Short term, we'll just take the money out of one savings account, use it for the general fund, and then when we collect the revenues, we'll pay it back. All of those funds are empty. Zero. Nothing. I mean, imagine that. The state of California is essentially bankrupt, although there is no legal condition of bankruptcy for a state. But we had no money. Nothing. The other problem was we couldn't borrow any money. And the credit markets are a little bit better now for our state bonds. The treasurer has gone out and he's actually encountered a better market than he expected. But we weren't able to borrow any money in the summer, and that's when we started paying our bills with IOUs. This is the 8th largest economy in the world. And what impacts us here impacts not only the nation, but also the world as a whole. So we essentially had 2 strikes, and we were looking at a third if we weren't able to pass our budget and get out to the market and borrow the money that we need short term to get through the year. So essentially, I know how difficult it is for school boards and colleges and universities to be raising fees, cutting back on classes, and doing all the things that you're having to do in order to balance the budgets. But if the state of California failed, everything fails. You can't operate a city or a county or a school or a university without the state of California being operational. And so I had to finally decide that as bad as this decision was, the alternative was worse. And that's how we ended up being able to go into negotiations with the governor and finally get to the point where we were able to get him to back off of closing down these programs, but we still had to make the very difficult cuts and the very difficult decisions that brought us here today. So how did this happen? And how can we fix it? And this part of this discussion is designed to give you some idea of how dysfunctional the system really is, and spark a discussion, not necessarily give you any answers, but at least spark a discussion about how we might go about fixing it and making it better. Yeah. So there's this myth that basically we have a spending problem. And this slide will show you what has actually gone into the last 10 years of growth in the general fund. About 3/4 of it is due to population growth and inflation. Next. There are also other variables that the legislature and the governor cannot control, and the biggest one is the voter-approved spending. And all of these nice initiatives, such as 3 strikes and you're out, and the governor's Proposition 49 after-school programs, and they sound really nice when we go to the polls, but not a single one of them has had a funding source. And so what happens when we adopt those initiatives is the voters say, here, legislature, you must spend money on this. And so everything else gets crowded out. And the granddaddy of that, and it's hard to say in this room, is Prop 98. It essentially mandated that we spend roughly half of our general fund budget on education. And I'm a huge believer in education, but we have got to somehow figure out how we're going to provide all of the services that Californians want. That's the big issue that we've got to grapple with. Another problem was when Arnold Schwarzenegger took over as governor, he unilaterally reversed the vehicle license fee. Now, in and of itself, that was a tax cut. It wasn't a spending initiative. But the vehicle license fee was a source of funding for local governments. So when he did this, he also went to cities and counties and said, don't worry, we'll backfill it. And I was on the Santa Rosa City Council at the time, and I thought, hey, that's great. Fine, our residents get a tax cut, I don't have to pay so much for my car, and he's going to keep the city whole. Well, it's ended up to be a $6 billion annual expenditure from the general fund. It's a huge, huge hit every single year. Next. Even though some school districts are experiencing declining enrollment, overall as a state, our school population is actually growing. Autism diagnosis is up 1,342%. That's just staggering. And what that means is that a person with that diagnosis is entitled under law to certain services provided by the state. And our population is aging, and of course as the population ages, it needs and asks for more and more services which cost more. Next.